All right, Job chapter 14. Let's call this one Chipping Away at Separation, in this chapter where it seems that even though Job is repeatedly requesting a hearing with God, he is not simply looking to accuse God, but a portion of what he's trying to do is chip away at his separation from God, still in the midst of all his suffering. In this chapter that starts off with another relatively famous verse, in verse 1, where it says, "Man who was born of a woman is few of days and full of trouble." Famous description of Job's condition. It seems like he is well justified in feeling that way. Another roughly famous verse maybe comes out of verse 4, where it says, "Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean thing?" Going back to that whole concept of no matter how much Job is calling himself blameless, he knows that he is not perfect. How do we know? Because he is going to continue on. And after repeating another familiar theme, look away from him and leave him alone, seeming to build on his own previous sentiments that he wanted at some points God to just leave him alone and give him a break, and saying mankind in general in their suffering probably feels the same way. But moving on, the part that really caught my attention most as I skip over some of the summary of the chapter really goes from verses 13 through 17, beginning in verse 13, where Job says, "Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, that you would conceal me until your wrath is past." Understanding that Sheol is that place that we looked at back in the days of Moses, when a group or a family within Israel called the Korathites, or the family of Korah, was swallowed up live into the earth and taken down into Sheol as a penalty for the rebellion against Moses, after he had already seemingly dealt with a ton of harassment from the children of Israel as he led them out of Egypt into their promised land, which likewise seems at least somewhat similar to a time in the Revelation where the sixth seal is open and the sky is described as being rolled back like a scroll to remove the separation between the earth and the heavenly places, provoking a response on the earth in more than a few as they flee to the caves and the rocks and the mountains, that they fall on them to hide them from the God they never believed would hold them accountable. Understanding back here in Job chapter 14 that Job is not being held accountable for his wrongdoing, but he is in the kind of prolonged suffering that makes even a seemingly unhappy place like Sheol a refuge from the misery he is currently enduring. But as the chapter concludes, he seems to abandon his hope for a refuge in Sheol by concluding that just as the mountains would fall and crumble before God toward the end of verse 19, he's going to say, "So you destroy the hope of man," before concluding in verse 22, "He feels only the pain of his own body, and he mourns for only himself," as he is describing in the previous verses, that no matter how much a man might care for his sons or his family, life can bring him into a place of misery where he cares only for his own suffering and mourns only for his own condition. In some ways, seeming to acknowledge one of the ways in which Satan challenged God by saying, look, you protected his body and he'll trade everything he has to preserve his health. But let me touch his health and he'll curse you to your face. That is something that Satan still has not been able to convince Job to do, even if he is acknowledging that his suffering has gotten to the point where he can really only mourn for himself at this point. And the thing that caught my attention in this particular chapter, when Job is appealing to relief in Sheol, it reminded me of two of Jesus's Beatitudes. One that says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," because as we've already suggested, Job did not simply want a hearing before God to relieve his suffering. He wanted to know what he had done wrong so that he could fix it. Understanding that second beatitude that caught my attention, which was, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God," reminding me of another Bible Project video I saw this week on a Hebrew word for peace that seems to be very similar to a concept that we've talked about before, and that is completeness. Job seeming to realize that if he does not hunger and thirst for righteousness, his peace with God will never truly be complete. Understanding that to the degree he still has to struggle with his sins, his transgressions, and his iniquities, he's running the risk of running right back into some version of the same misery he's looking for God to relieve him from right now, which is one of the reasons why we often say, "My prayer for you is my prayer for me," that to the degree Job, even though he had not sinned, realized that once he got relief from God, the only way to make sure he did not have to return to any portion of the misery he was seeking to be free from was to have a complete peace with God that came through hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And even though being thirsty can carry a whole lot of negative connotations, today I pray that we find the kind of relief from both our past and present struggles that can really only come to the degree that we are thirsty for doing what's right, or as Jesus said, to the degree that we hunger and thirst for righteousness.